This morning's passage is from Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 to 30. For it is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. The one who had received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had the 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, "Master, you handed over to me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more talents." His master said to him, "Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master." And the one with the 2 talents also came forward, saying, "Master, you handed over to me 2 talents. See, I have made 2 more talents." His master said to him, "Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master." Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, "Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours." But his master replied, "You wicked and lazy slave, you knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow, and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with the 10 talents. For to all those who have to have, more will be given, and they will have in abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth."
Thank you, Jan. We're having some fun now, aren't we, kids? A guy makes an appointment with a pain specialist because for weeks he has been just hurting everywhere. He goes into the office and sits down on the exam table, explains the situation to the doctor. Doctor looks him over a bit, and so in order to get the lay of the land, try to get a sense of exactly what's going on, the doctor says to the guy, "All right, I'd like you to touch your own elbow." And the guy does, and just immediately winces in pain. Doctor says, okay. All right, now touch your knee. The guy does, and now the reaction's even more pronounced. Guy grimaces in pain. Doctor, All right, one more thing. I want you to touch your head. When the guy does, he practically jumps off the table in pain. After he calms down for a second, he says to the doctor, you see what I mean, Doc? You see what I mean? There's got to be something seriously wrong with me. Doctor just doesn't say anything, just continues to look the guy over. And then all of a sudden, completely out of nowhere, doctor reaches out, grabs the man's index finger, and squeezes as hard as he can. The guy screams in agony, nearly in tears, yells back at the doctor, "What the heck, Doc? What's wrong with you?" The doctor says, "Well, there's nothing wrong with me, and there's really nothing wrong with you either, except that your index finger's broken." See, the problem isn't always or necessarily where we think or believe it is. The problem isn't always where or what or who we want to believe it is, or the world wants us to believe it is. The passage that Jan just shared with us with such dramatic flair is the parable, the well-known parable to us, the parable of the talents. And that parable immediately follows the one that we explored last week in Matthew's Gospel, the parable of the 10 bridesmaids. And both, as we discussed last week, are part of an extended section toward the end of Matthew's Gospel, in which Matthew has Jesus addressing the subject of his return after his death and resurrection with his closest followers. And again, as we talked about last week, there's a lot of debate among scholars as to whether Jesus actually had that concern, but very little debate as to whether Matthew's community, 60 or so years after Jesus' death, did. See, again, in the immediate aftermath of Jesus' death and resurrection, the first generation of Christians had a common belief that he was coming back and coming back soon. But 60 or so years later, when Matthew is writing to and for his early Christian community, that has not happened yet. And so Matthew includes this extended section toward the end of his gospel to assure his fellow Christians that yes, in fact, Jesus is still coming back. It's just that no one knows when. And then, as we talked about last week, he inserts Jesus telling this parable of the 10 bridesmaids in order to encourage his fellow Christians in their time and place and context to keep awake, to stay ready and prepared and faithful for when Jesus does return. Now, Matthew uses this parable, the parable of the talents, to encourage his fellow Christians to do something else. Matthew has Jesus tell a story about a man who will soon be identified to us as the Master, who prepares to go on a long journey. And in preparation for that journey, he entrusts 5 talents to one of his servants. A talent in that time and place, a rather significant amount of money. So we know we are in the realm of story because 5 talents would have been an astoundingly great amount of money. The man entrusts 5 talents to one servant, 2 to a second servant, and 1 to a third servant. And then the man heads to the Cayman Islands. As we're told, the man is gone for a long time because, well, it's the Cayman Islands. When he returns, the first servant enthusiastically runs up to the master and says, I took those 5 talents you gave me and I made 5 more with them. And the master effusively praises the first servant. Says, nice work, nice work. Because of what you have done, I am going to put you in charge of a whole lot more. And then the master welcomes that servant into the master's joy, as the parable puts it. Same thing for the second servant. But the third servant, oh, the third servant's the problem. Because the third servant just took the talent he was given and buried it in the ground. And the master is not thrilled. The master disparages the third servant as being wicked and lazy, takes the talent the third servant was given, and then throws the third servant off the estate into the darkness. For Matthew, this parable, the parable of the talents, is intended to be the other side of the same spiritual coin that the parable of the 10 bridesmaids is the other side of. In the parable of the 10 bridesmaids, Matthew calls his fellow Christians in that time and place and context to keep awake, calls them to stay ready, prepared, faithful for when Jesus returns. With the parable of the talents, he calls his fellow Christians to not just wait, but wait actively. To use their talents, which for Matthew symbolizes not just wealth, material resources, but all of the gifts and material resources and abilities that God has blessed us with. Calls them to use those for the sake of the master. Okay. And again, as we talked about last week, as was the case with Matthew's use of the parable of the 10 bridesmaids, it's really good, solid, practical, spiritual advice. I mean, we should. We should use the talents that God has blessed us with to the fullest for the sake of the master, for the sake of the estate. Because, see, in Matthew's symbolism, of course, the master is Jesus. And the estate is the kingdom of heaven, that time and place when the world comes into union with God and God's ways. And the first and second servants, well, they're meant to be Matthew's fellow Christians. They're meant to be us. But the third servant, well, again, the third servant's the problem. We're not to be the third servant. We're not to be like the third servant. Again, as was with the case with the parable of the 10 bridesmaids in Matthew's context and for Matthew's purposes, it's good, solid, practical, spiritual advice. But again, as we talked about last week, that's the last thing that parables are meant to do. Again, a parable is a story that is meant to engage us in moral and ethical and spiritual reflection and questioning. The parable in its pure form, as Jesus much more likely told it in his time to his followers, was meant to be provocative. It was meant to challenge common beliefs and attitudes and assumptions about how God calls us to live, and just as importantly, how the world works or is supposed to work. there's nothing provocative. As good as Matthew's intentions and purposes and spiritual advice are, there's nothing provocative about any of that. And then there's this other little problem. This problem with Matthew's symbolism. Because if the master is supposed to be Jesus, what do we make of the third servant's characterization of the master as essentially unethical, immoral, and even criminal? A characterization that the master does not refute. The question, you knew, did you, that I was such and such and such and such? That is the master's response to that characterization. Most scholars consider that to be a rhetorical question. And some translations take out the question mark completely. Completely. That doesn't seem to be a Jesus worth waiting for. The parable then, as Jesus much more likely told it, was about a real-world master and real-world servants and real-world resources, material resources. And if that's the case, the master isn't Jesus. The master is not a good guy. Okay? Beautifully characterized, I might add, Jan, because you made the master sound exactly like a not-so-good guy. Unethical, immoral, criminal. Which then makes the first and second servants accessories, accomplices. Accomplices to something that should not be in God's eyes. And enthusiastic accomplices. Whether intentionally enthusiastic or unthinkingly enthusiastic, we don't know. It is one of the things that a parable is meant to challenge us to consider. Why do they participate in something that should not be in God's eyes? Well, maybe because, as we see, they're handsomely rewarded for it. Or maybe they simply think that's just the way things are. That's just the system, the norm, the way things work, the way things are supposed to work. Again, we don't know. It is, again, something the parable challenges us to consider. But as Dorothy Sanders Wells, an Episcopal priest and author, suggests, those considerations lead us to have to also consider then that the first and second servants are not the paragons of faithfulness that Matthew's purposes present them as. And neither is the third servant the paragon of unfaithfulness. Instead, Wells says, it's the exact opposite. It's the exact opposite. Because the third servant refuses. The third servant refuses to participate in what should not be in God's eyes. The third servant refuses to participate, even though the third servant is afraid of what the master will do to the third servant if the third servant doesn't participate. The very thing that the master does do to the third servant at the end of the story. But as Wells says, the third servant still refuses to participate in what is not right. And that makes the third servant the truly faithful one. Because they are faithful not to some earthly master, but to the real master, the most important master, Jesus, and the God that he embodies. from that perspective then, the parable does, in line with Matthew's purposes, call us to actively wait, just a different kind of active waiting. The parable calls us to the active waiting of refusal. It calls us to refuse to participate in the things, the systems, the assumptions, the beliefs, the attitudes, the norms in the world that should not be in God's eyes. It challenges us to refuse to participate. For example, going back to last week's parable of the 10 bridesmaids, to refuse to participate in a society, a culture which disparages the poor, which automatically assumes that they are, in the words of this parable, wicked and lazy. It challenges us to refuse to participate in a society, in a culture, in which others gain, and sometimes gain handsomely, by encouraging us to be suspicious of, to even hate and demonize others who believe differently than we do, or who vote differently than we do, who are loved differently than we do. A society, a culture, which encourages us to treat decency and civility as the behavior of losers. A society, a culture, in which the elderly and those who are disabled are seen as having less than full value in the world. A society, a culture, in which far too many gain through unethical and immoral and even criminal means. And it is treated as just the way things are. Just the cost of doing business. But those ways are not of God. Those ways are like a broken finger that hurt everything and everywhere they touch. And yes, if we refuse to participate in those things, in that kind of society, that kind of culture, we may very well be treated just like the third servant is treated by the master. We too may be disparaged, dismissed, cast out. Disparaged, dismissed, cast out by the world's masters. But again, not by the master that matters. Jesus and the God he embodies. For Jesus and the God he embodies, if and when we refuse to participate in things that should not be in God's eyes, we are not the problem. The world's broken fingers are. Amen.